This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ted Koppel.
Thank you. Oh, come on, don't give up that soon. You see, that's why people run for president. All that agony for a few seconds of ecstasy. Kind of like adultery, isn't it? Since somewhere out here, my beloved wife, whom I met here on the Stanford campus 46 years ago, since she is sitting out here, there you are. The answer, dear, is no. And I'm not running for president either. You may wonder, having looked at the list of our distinguished panelists, whom I will introduce to you in just a moment, why me? And the answer is simple. I have an intuition that borders at times on the eerie. For example, I know what many of you are thinking. Not all of you, but many of you. You're thinking, he's a lot shorter than I thought he was. And some of you have sort of nudged your neighbors and said, I don't care what anybody says, he's wearing a rug. Let me assure you that ABC paid me enough over the last 43 years that if I had to wear a rug, I could afford a better looking one than this. Now, let me point out to you that that's probably the last giggle we're going to get together today. In case you haven't read your programs, or in case it's too dark where you're sitting to read them, the title of our topic this morning is Anxious Times, and let me begin by introducing to you what is truly an extraordinary panel, and the fact that all of them and all of us are products of Stanford should give you some considerable pride. So let me begin by pulling out my glasses, which broke about half an hour ago, and I have fixed them with gaffer's tape, so we'll see how well that works. And I would like to begin by introducing Jerry Yang. Come on out, please, Jerry. Jerry Yang, as you know, if you've been reading your program, and if you made it through 4 years of Stanford and still can't read, I will tell you that he is a co-founder of Yahoo, A Taiwanese native raised in San Jose, California, Mr. Yang co-created the Yahoo Internet Navigational Guide in April 1994 with David. Does he pronounce it Philo or Philo? Philo, with David Philo. And please welcome now our second very distinguished guest, the Honorable Anthony M. Kennedy. I believe he is a justice of the peace or something somewhere.
I can't fix a traffic ticket.
The Honorable Justice Kennedy is, of course, an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, nominated by President Reagan. He took his seat in 1988. Which brings us to our third panelists, one of your very own here, George P. Shultz.
This is for the president.
No, I think you were going for the right seat. Don't ever let
never listens to me.
You know, when that's the problem. It's the judicial branch always trying to get messing around with the executive branch.
Guy gets no peace.
Elijah will be joining us just a little bit later. Actually, I haven't yet done justice, if I may, to Secretary Shultz, who held just about every cabinet post, but the senior most of which was Secretary of State, of course. And Dr. Shultz is the Thomas W. and Susan B. Ford Distinguished Fellow at the Hoover Institution. And beyond that has done so many things that I would be taking up too much of all of our time here this morning. Very good to have you with us. Another former senior cabinet officer, William Perry. Dr. Perry is the Michael and Barbara Barbarian Professor here at Stanford and was from 1994 to 1997 U.S. Secretary of Defense. And I should point out, and we're probably going to begin with this, something of an expert on arms control and North Korea. Our next guest, Dr. Lucy Shapiro. Dr. Shapiro is the Virginia and D.K. Ludwig Professor in the School of Medicine and Professor of Developmental Biology and Director of the Beckman Center on Molecular and Genetic Medicine at Stanford. Dr. Shapiro, thank you for joining us. And now, I've been waiting all morning to say this name, Jean-Pierre Garnier.
Done.
Mr. Garnier, referred to by friends and colleagues as JP, is Chief Executive Officer of GlaxoSmithKline, the world's second largest pharmaceutical company. We couldn't get the CEO of the world's largest pharmaceutical But I have little doubt he wouldn't have been nearly as much fun.
I hope so.
And finally, a fellow by the name of Hennessy.
Well, welcome, everyone. We're delighted to have you here. We're delighted to have so many of our alumni, our local friends, our faculty and staff at this wonderful time for reunion. The panel is a serious one this morning, but I think, as we were all reminded last week when Stanford became the winner of 2 Nobel Prizes, our goal in the university is to think about how we can affect the future in a positive way. And I think while we face challenging times, we also face great opportunities to overcome those challenges. And I think that's one of the things we want to try and touch on in this panel this morning. Ted, take it away.
Dr. Hennessy, thank you. As I suggested a moment ago, and Dr. Perry, I'm going to begin by coming to you. What the hell do we do about North Korea apparently having exploded an atomic device? What do we do next?
Ted, I'm sorry to say that all of the really good alternatives are now behind us. We're confronted now with only bad alternatives. The danger of having them continue with a nuclear bomb program is going to send a very bad signal to Iran. We can expect if North Korea proceeds building a nuclear arsenal, Iran will follow closely behind. And if that happens, we can expect a nuclear arms race both in the Asian area and in the Mideast area. All this is very bad news, not just because proliferation is a bad word, but because it increases the probability of a terrorist getting a nuclear bomb. So I think this is very bad news indeed, and we do not have many good alternatives open to us. The least bad alternative is taking firm action to stop them from carrying the nuclear program farther than it is. They already have 8 to 10 nuclear bombs, but they have the capacity to build about another 10 a year. And that would convert a disaster into a catastrophe if that happened.
You're smart enough, Secretary Shultz, not to leave this nice warm sinecure you've got here at the Hoover Institution, but if by some stroke of fate you tomorrow were to be Secretary of State again, what do you do? I mean, given all the bad alternatives that Dr. Perry has spoken of, what options are there?
I would do 2 different kinds of things, because I think on the one hand you have to confront what is going on right now and do something about it. And at the same time, I'd try to lift people's eyes up to the horizon and give some spirit of something better. Right now, I would try to reinstitute something that Bill Perry did a few years ago. He was commissioned by the President and the Secretary of State at the time to go around to the key countries involved, the countries now involved in the so-called 6-party talks, capital by capital, head of state by head of state, trying to put the pieces together of people's outlook and be in a position to say authoritatively to the North Koreans, here is what you confront. And I think that kind of process of high-level, energetic diplomacy by a person of stature, like Bill Perry, there aren't too many Bill Perrys, unfortunately, but a person of stature is a way to go. You have to engage energetically. And in the process, try to get it so that the UN process itself can come to a conclusion. It's a crisis that the UN says something or other is unacceptable, and then it happens and they accept it. So people have got to have the chance to follow through.
But quite clearly, among that group of 6 are at least 2 parties, the Chinese and the Russians, who are not prepared to go along with the kinds of sanctions that would be stiff enough that they might really cause the North Koreans to rethink what they have done or what they are going to do. And having said that, although the US government is pushing stiff sanctions, including, I might add, the on-sea inspection of ships leaving North Korean ports, and I do want to open this discussion up to anyone who wants to join in. And as I said to some of you yesterday when we gathered here, I want this to be not just a dialogue, but a multi-log in the sense that it should be a conversation among all of you. How in heaven's name is that going to work? Can you, I'm going to ask both, first of all, Secretary Shultz and Secretary Perry, because they really do have the most expertise in this area, just to give us another couple of minutes. The last time that we had a naval blockade like that was against Soviet, or not against, was to ensure that Soviets were not bringing more nuclear missiles into Cuba, and to examine Soviet ships as they were leaving with the missiles that they had installed in Cuba. And we were terrified at the time, as I recall, that the Soviets might try to run the blockade, and then what would we do? What in heaven's name would we do if the Russians and the Chinese went along with our idea for sanctions, went along with our idea of examining these ships as they leave North Korean ports, and some North Korean ship decides to make a run for it and will not allow us to board?
Well, you have to follow up. Shoot.
Well, that's a happy notion.
That's lifting your eyes upward, George.
As World War II started, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. And when you enlist in the Marine Corps, you don't become a Marine, you become a boot. And you go to boot camp, and you never forget it. You become a Marine if you emerge successfully from boot camp. So I remember the day the sergeant handed me my rifle. He said, "This is your best friend. Take good care of it. And remember," he said, "never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger." Now, what we see in front of us from all dimensions is a continuous process of pointing the gun at people and not being willing to pull the trigger. Whether you're talking about humanitarian matters, as in Darfur, whether you're talking about disarming Hezbollah in Lebanon, whether you're talking about starting the Iranian enrichment process up again, or North Korea doing things that have been declared unacceptable. You've got to be willing to follow through.
At the risk of disagreeing with my elders and betters, and you are both, we pulled the trigger in Iraq, and we're wishing we hadn't. We pulled the trigger in Afghanistan. The Israelis pulled the trigger against Hezbollah.
No, Hezbollah pulled the trigger against Israel.
And Israel responded robustly.
Let's not forget where this aggression came from.
I'm sorry?
Don't forget where the aggression came from.
No. I'm not suggesting who began. I'm suggesting the Israelis certainly responded forcefully. You can't say they didn't respond forcefully enough.
Are you trying to argue that force never works?
What I'm trying to argue is...
I think you have to remember that there's two sides to this. And North Korea is, in effect, accumulating strength and force. And if we're determined to stop it in the case that you gave, well, if they try to run the blockade, you've got to stop them from doing it. That doesn't mean you hit them amidships, but you can stop a ship. And remember one thing. There has been a semi-blockade earlier. And through the Multi-Country Proliferation Security Initiative, a North Korean ship was intercepted on its way to Libya. And I believe it was a considerable amount of material for the enrichment process that was captured. And that called attention to Gaddafi that people were onto him and that it wasn't very healthy to have weapons of mass destruction. And that led to one of the real triumphs in all of this, namely Libya is one state now that no longer is trying to have weapons of mass destruction. So that's a case where not a blockade, but a willingness to stop a ship worked.
Ted, let me chime in and
Please.
First of all, agree with much of what George said. I want to take exception on one point. This senior envoy he's talking about ought to be George Shultz, not Bill Perry. But my point about the diplomacy he's talking about, I completely agree. we're going to have a difficult problem. We have to deal with people. We have to talk with them. I favor coercive diplomacy, which is diplomacy backed by strength and by the show of force.
Absolutely.
But it has to be diplomacy. It has to involve many other nations. We have to get to cooperation of other nations in this. And finally, a comment about the blockade. In my judgment, whether or not you face the problems that you and George have been discussing, a blockade is not to the point. The point we're concerned about is North Korea transferring enough plutonium to another country or to a terror group that could allow them to make a bomb. That plutonium is about the size of a grapefruit. And if anybody believes that the naval blockade is going to stop their ability to do that, they are naive. This is a country that has, for decades, has become expert in smuggling. And if you think we can stop them smuggling a grapefruit out of North Korea, you haven't been following what's been going on in the drug trade coming into the United States.
Let me, if I may, stay on this subject, and please, if you want to jump in, go right ahead.
I think we also ought to raise our sights. And we had on campus the last couple of days a really extraordinary discussion on the 20th anniversary of Reykjavik, the meeting between President Reagan and President Gorbachev there. Bill and I both took part. And you remember what they talked about. They talked about abolishing nuclear weapons. President Reagan always thought they were a moral disaster. Gorbachev agreed. So why don't we take a deep breath and say, we have all these problems today. We've got to deal with them, as we've been talking. Korea's not the only one. But let's also raise our sights and say the world would be better off if nobody had nuclear weapons. And we're willing to have a program to do that. And you can't snap your fingers and bring something like that about, but if you say this is what ought to be, then you can start taking steps to get there. For instance, you can see if you can't get control of the enrichment process and say to any country that wants to have a nuclear power plant, you're guaranteed the enriched uranium to the extent needed for power at a reasonable price. You don't have to build your own enrichment facilities. That's the enrichment facilities and the capacity to get up to weapons grade is the problem. And there are a whole lot of steps that could be taken, aspired to. But if you have a vision out there, here's where you're trying to go. And you've got to deal with current problems, deal with them. But against a background of a vision, I think you're better off.
I don't want to let the issue of robust diplomacy backed by force just lie there.
There is no other kind of effective diplomacy.
I take your point, but let me also...
But force is not just military force.
Right. It can be economic, it can be political, it can be banking. I get that. I really do. But Dr. Perry, you might want to refresh the memory of those who have forgotten and inform those who don't know. What happened after the North Koreans shot down a U.S. reconnaissance plane? I think it was back in about 1969. What happened after the USS Pueblo was captured by the North Koreans? What did the U.S. government do? Nothing. Nothing. And how many artillery pieces are sitting on the northern side of the DMZ, many of them tipped with chemical weapons that could hit Seoul in a matter of moments? How viable is forceful military action against North Korea? How sensible a proposition is that?
Ted, all of those problems existed when I visited Pyongyang about 6 years ago. And I presented them with the two alternatives. One alternative indeed was a forceful alternative. It said you stop your long-range missile program and your nuclear programs or the United States, South Korea, Japan will join forces to stop you. That was a forceful alternative, and it was presented very clearly to them. But at the same time, that's the coercive part of the course of diplomacy. But there's also a diplomatic part of it. I also presented them the opportunity to become a normal nation, to develop their economy, to get assistance from the United States and Japan and South Korea to doing that. So they had a clear alternative. And in my judgment, they were prepared at that time to take the positive alternative.
And what went wrong?
What went wrong is that we had a changing administration about that point, and the new administration decided not to pursue the talks. This is not a Republican or Democrat thing. It is a thing that the new administration thought they would have a better way of dealing with the problem. And in my judgment, they did not. But in any event, they stopped that diplomacy at the time.
So I'm still not sure. I mean, short of you sending Dr. Perry and Dr. Perry sending you to the region.
We'll send our wives. We'll send our...
Take a crack. This is one of the few subjects we're going to be talking about on which I suspect the Supreme Court will not have to render a position. So you can...
There's a photo recently released taken from space, and it shows lights all over the world. You see South America, North America, the continent of Europe. You see Southeast Asia and Asia. You see the lights of Hong Kong, Seoul, Beijing, and there's a dark spot. That dark spot is North Korea. They do have at least 20,000 artillery pieces tipped, as you say, with the chemical and biological weapons. The Chinese are in a difficult position. They can't assist in an effort which brings the regime to its knees so that the regime collapses, because then you might have thugs in various regions which will take these weapons. On the other hand, I don't think that they would be happy with a thriving, prosperous, united Korea. They are in a difficult spot, but that's one of the places where the lights are on. Those are people with whom we can talk, and we must convince them that this premise that you adopted at the outset of an international blockade and of international action is absolutely essential for their own security and for ours. There was a study made not long ago of places in the world where the generation gap is the least and the generation gap is the greatest, differing attitudes, perceptions on the part of young people and older people. The biggest generation gap in the world is in South Korea. For 20 years, for 30 years, their students were taught that the existing situation in North Korea and the lack of unification is the fault of the United States. Slowly, the South Korean establishment has begun trying to communicate with its own young people about this. But this shows, President Hennessy, that one of the broader vision things that Secretary Shultz talked about is reaching the hearts and minds of young people. And that's just being done in South Korea. It's a little late. North Korea, on the blockade, Secretary Perry's right. They're little boats, small craft, that have completely destabilized what looked like a stable situation with drug. Methamphetamine comes out by the ton from North Korea, counterfeit money, and it's very difficult to stop that.
Jerry Yang, as Justice Kennedy talks about that dark spot on the globe, way long ago, when the internet was first created by the folks at the Pentagon, it was created in order to be, correct me if I'm wrong here, Dr. Perry, survivable in the case of a nuclear attack, so that in fact our military could communicate even after a nuclear attack in this country. I've just come back from 2 weeks in Iran, which is the other half of the proliferation equation here, where the internet is being used famously and quite productively, despite all the efforts of the government to block certain sites. Is there any activity coming out of North Korea?
Ted, not really. There is, I'm sure there are very well controlled sort of research or governmental things, but there's probably, or certainly not anything we see, anything of a consumer-based internet activity. And at the risk of talking about something I know nothing about, which is probably the best value I'm adding here, I feel like there is a bit of a perfect storm gathering in the sense that, and I'm reminded of a conversation that Secretary Shultz and I had, and it seems to be unanimous around political circles, is the lack of conversations we're having with Iran or North Korea that was teed up maybe, as recently as 10 years ago, and certainly when in the early 90s. That lack of conversation, plus I think a fairly busted model at the United Nations, and it's ironic that, or interesting that the new Secretary General is going to be a South Korean. That the UN today and the Security Council and the way it's structured, just it doesn't seem like a governance body. It's a negotiation entity, and when you have the U.S. not having any dialogue with the potential threats, and you have a dysfunctional UN, I don't know how you can effectively solve these issues. But getting back to the internet, I think we have seen the decentralized nature of the technology is in large part driving the openness and decentralization of information, which has, I think, created not only a technology boom, but also an economic and a social boom. But we are also seeing that different beliefs and different ways of operating countries are using or leveraging or utilizing that same technology for their purposes, and whether it's China or Iran or other parts of the world, you have this emerging debate around whether this medium is being used for governmental purposes, or is the consumers and the masses are eventually going to be able to leverage this in an open and unfettered way. We obviously believe that the scale of all this is driving towards a world where we're going to see more openness and more freedom to communicate between each other among people. But I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that will happen. I think it'll take both debate as well as action. But fundamentally, I see more opportunities than threats. Not to say that there aren't any. In fact, there are some real ones in terms of being able to create that openness. But I do think it will come eventually.
President Hennessy, let me bring you into this conversation. I was going to come to you last, but it seems like an opportune moment. Government to government, we're not doing very well. Our international bodies, like the United Nations, are finding themselves stymied. Even the internet, which is supposed to be able to slip through any and all borders, isn't doing the job in North Korea. What about the world of academia? Is there any contact whatsoever? And if there isn't, could there be? Is this an opportunity?
Well, I think it is, Ted. We're generally better in the academy about thinking about the long-term trajectory and how we should solve problems. I think it's why Secretary Shultz's recommendation that we think beyond nuclear weapons, because while North Korea and Iran are the current threats, there are further threats down the line. And I think, as Secretary Perry said, the amount of material we're talking about is relatively small. And that's where the university can play a role, thinking about policies and doing the analysis that would get us beyond the current situation. We also have a remarkable ability, I think, as Secretary Shultz and Perry were at this conference the other day, to be the convening group, to bring together a group of thought leaders to talk about the problem. Because in the end, forming a plan of action has to begin with that discussion about what the alternatives are and a careful weighing and assessment of those alternatives. And this is something that I think the academy can do. In the end, government has to be the tool, and negotiation has to be the tool that government uses to find a solution. But we can provide an invaluable role in looking at policy and helping to formulate them.
Are you, is there any contact whatsoever? Have any of your professors or graduate students, any of your researchers made it into North Korea?
Could I add?
So
yeah.
I think this is Bill's area, actually.
There's what's called Track 2 diplomacy. That's diplomacy between non-government officials. Ever since I've been out of office, I've been meeting yearly with the Chinese delegation, for example. And on the one side and on our side was a joint team of Stanford and Harvard professors meeting with them. The last meeting of which was just a few weeks ago. In terms of North Korea, we have here at Stanford Professor Lewis and Professor Hecker, who met about a year ago at the nuclear facility, Yongbyon, and actually Professor Hecker actually held some plutonium in his hands. So, and they have been invited to come back next month, and I hope they take that invitation because it will give us access to information about what's really going on over there. So yes, I think the academic delegation can play a very important role, but it is Track 2. It ends up being recommendations to our government. We're not in position to, we don't have any authority to act for the government.
Dr. Shapiro, you and I were seatmates yesterday at dinner. And we were talking about the fact that many of the procedures, many of the defense mechanisms that as a nation we ought to be putting in place in the event of, let's say, a pandemic would be equally useful in the event of what this conversation has really been about, the possibility that somehow there will be a nexus between terrorism and a weapon of mass destruction.
Yes.
That's what gives this administration and previous administrations, and I can guarantee you, whoever it will be, the next administration, nightmares.
Yes.
Talk about that for a moment.
Well, I think right now we're faced with the possibility of a pandemic. And we all read about Asian flu and H5n1, and it's very frightening. But in fact, right now, H5n1 is a disease of poultry and migratory birds.
We're talking here about avian flu.
We're talking about avian flu.
Define pandemic for us.
Pandemic means that it's outside of the confines of an epidemic in a city, in an area, or used to be a nation. And I say used to be because now we are a global village. And anything we do here in this country has to be echoed and reiterated and have a sense of communication globally. Here in the United States, anything we do to shore up our response to a possible pandemic is equally useful for any sort of bioterrorist attack that deals with bioweapons.
We were in agreement last night that by and large, government hasn't been doing a terribly effective job.
Yes.
Your opinion on this is worth a lot more than mine is, so please give vent.
So we've had 2 episodes that have taught us that we are woefully ill-prepared. The first one was the advent of West Nile virus, which took us a while to understand. And I might add, in the past 30 years, this globe has seen 32 new diseases emerge. And they're emerging at an increasing rate because of the way in which our globe is now structured, interacting, the imposition of poverty, so that there are more and more of these emerging infectious diseases. And how we deal with these emerging infectious diseases, as we dealt poorly with West Nile, and then better with SARS, much better with SARS, even though that is a much milder disease. It is not communicable until symptoms appear. Now we have escalated to a virus, H5n1 Asian flu, that has the possibility of being as bad as the 1918 flu. But the good news is we know a great deal more now.
Now, we need to remind people that the 1918 flu probably killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people around the world.
Yes, it was very, very bad.
And that was at a time when the global population was below 2 billion.
Yes.
So by today's standards, we would be talking about, I mean, if it were the equivalent, we'd be talking about 200 or 300 million dead.
So as I said, there is some good news. And
that ain't it.
That ain't it. The good news is that we know a great deal more now. And after the SARS epidemic, the CDC and across this country set up a 122 city integrated network so that all emerging infections are reported, collated, and followed. The trouble with that kind of thing is it must be global now. And if we have an outbreak in Jakarta, or if we have an outbreak in a town in Central Africa, we need to know that. And I just don't mean us, I mean the world. I mean not only the CDC, I mean WHO, the World Health Organization, so that we can put out the fire then. So there's an outbreak, we have to stamp it down and end it there. Because once something like this happens, once the Asian flu, which is now just for birds, mutates so that we can get person-to-person communication, and it will be very, very rapid fire, then we'll have a very, very hard time keeping it down.
All right, this has been much too cheerful a conversation, JP. So I'd like you to bring a little reality to it.
Sure.
Let us say it mutates, that avian flu mutates to a point that it is person to person. How long will it take your company to develop a vaccine? And once you have developed it, how long will it take you before you can produce sufficient vaccine that everyone in the United States could get it?
Let me step back for a minute, because I think many of the issues we're discussing here find a problem at the source, and the problem is global versus national interest. There are many issues now which cannot be determined and defined by a nation. Yes. Whether it's pollution or nuclear proliferation or pandemics. Wild geese don't recognize borders. They really don't care about borders. To some extent, for some of those issues, geography is history. And yet, when you talk about pandemic, Lucy and I, we go to see the president in this country. There is a special group of people, the highest members of the cabinet, to discuss what we're going to do about pandemic. And I have the same conversations in China and in other countries. And it's striking how their priorities are to try to protect the American public in the case of the US, or the Chinese public in case of China, by using ways and processes which are purely national for a problem that cannot be contained. And in fact, the solution to the problem is not to try to defend every single country. Let me give you some specifics. We have a vaccine that could possibly be effective against an H5n1 mutant. So if the mutation is not too far from the core, from the existing virus, we have demonstrated that actually our vaccine is effective.
Although you cannot know for sure until...
We cannot know for sure, but this one fork in the road is what kind of mutation. Let's take the positive, let's take the cheerful approach.
Right.
That this is hard, guys, you know. Try to crack jokes and talk about pandemic. Only Ted can do that. There's another issue. We don't have enough doses of the vaccine. There's not enough production in the world to cover the universe. So the smart solution is not to have the US stock what they can and Canada stock what they can. And frankly, that's kind of the discussion with those governments. They want to buy, they want to hoard whatever we have. They put some subtle pressure on us to make sure that if something would happen, there would be the army around the manufacturing facilities the next day and all this, when in fact the solution is to nip it in the bud. It's to find where the infection starts. And CDC is doing a very good job to spot it early, so we have a good chance to get the early signal, and then airship whatever it takes, draw a big circle around the focus of infection, and vaccinate everybody. This is our best shot at the problem. And and it's hard to convince individual governments that this is a solution. In fact, you know, we're back to the issue of if we don't have a clear recognition of a strong United Nations type organization, that some issues are now global issues, and you know, countries have to give up their exclusive monopoly on them and let a strong United Nations type organization deal with this, we're not going to have solutions. We're going to be having the same conversation in a few years.
You know, we have to move to this particular subject right now, because I think what you've raised is exceptionally important. And Justice Kennedy, maybe you would express yourself on the subject from your unique vantage point on the Supreme Court. I see our own country degenerating into a level of partisanship that I don't think I've ever seen before. And it's been bad before, but I think it's worse today. We can't even agree among ourselves as Americans what is the best thing to do, what is a really viable policy. Can you imagine if JP were to come to the president, whoever he is, and say, Mr. President, I realize we only have X 100,000 doses of this new vaccine, but I am recommending to you that we ship it off to Indonesia so that we can nip it in the bud out there before it comes here, and word gets out. Bulletin, CNN.
Or ABC News.
Hey, listen, I left. I don't care what ABC. But somehow the bulletin gets out there. XYZ News has learned that the president has taken the last strategic supply of vaccine and shipped it to Jakarta, for heaven's sake. What do you think would happen?
Well, all politics is local, and political actors respond to a political environment. What has to occur over the next decade, the next generation, is an awareness that because of globalization, this generation of Americans, your students who are now about to graduate, have less control over their economy, their politics, their culture, their life than any previous generation. We've never been wholly autonomous. But our destiny is linked, for good or bad, with the rest of the world. This doesn't necessarily mean a world government. World governments, as Jerry pointed out, which should be the most accountable, are the least accountable, and this is quite wrong. There must be diversity among national governments in order to protect our national interests and in order to make international organizations work not just like an exclusive club. On the other hand, there must be an awareness that our destiny is linked, both in the terms of immediate problems, curing disease, and the larger problem, which is to get agreement in the world of ideas. Ultimately, our best security is in the world of ideas. And we are falling behind in making that clear, first of all, to our own people, and secondly, to the rest of the world. You talk about the government. The government of the United States and the people of the United States have to take a hard look at how well we're functioning. It used to be that the voters picked their legislators. Now the legislators pick their voters. It used to be that lobbyists went to legislators to pass the laws. Now the legislatures go to the lobbyists to pass the law. We have to take a hard look at how our government works, and this means, President, education in some basic values of democratic responsibility. Look, you don't take a DNA test to see if you believe in democracy. It's taught. And democracy must be preserved, transmitted, defended. You can't preserve something you don't understand. You can't transmit something you haven't learned. You can't defend what you don't know. There are students at major universities around the country who cannot name the 3 branches of government. We have to begin with the basics, and part of the basics is to take a good hard look at how our government is working and to fix it. It's not rocket science, it can be fixed.
When you talk, Justice Kennedy, about the nationalism here at home, I was telling Dr. Shapiro yesterday, maybe you know whether this is true or not. I don't, but I have heard that the Chinese government has been treating its chicken population with Tamiflu. Now, I should point out, A, that Tamiflu is one of the very few medicines we have that is believed to have an inhibiting effect in the very, very early stages of avian flu. I should point out, however, that if you treat the chickens with the Tamiflu, that the worst thing will happen. The chickens will ultimately develop, well, you tell me.
Well, sorry to say, Ted, but that's not accurate.
It's not true?
No. So we don't have to worry about treating. No, what is happening, China took action on this issue in a very strange way. They decided maybe we can treat all the chicken on a regular basis and therefore stop the spread of H5n1, and if we stop the spread of the virus, then maybe it will not mutate. Frankly, that plan was deemed to fail and did fail, but in the process, and the way they would treat it is by using, vaccines instead of antiviral protection. Antiviral protection, all it does, it protects you for a week or 2 if you were in contact with the virus. So this is a very important kind of medicine. There are only 2, Tamiflu, and I wish you had mentioned the other one because it happened to be our product, Relanza. Want me to spell it? And the governments have stocked up on both products because this would give us a little time if there was such a pandemic event. In China, they tried to treat the chicken. They realized they were making it worse because by moving from one small farm to the next small farm, they were actually, the people were supposed to take, they were transmitting, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that stopped. Besides, the cycle of renewal of a chicken flock is very quick, so it didn't make sense. No, the solution is not there.
Before we move on, and just so you don't think I've forgotten how elegantly you evaded my question about 10 minutes ago, how long would it take if you were able to develop the vaccine? In other words, the avian flu evolves to the point or devolves to the point where it's going human to human, and your scientists begin work. How long before we have an adequate supply?
So we dealt with the favorable part of the fork on the road. That is, the mutation stays close to the H5n1 virus. In that case,
not a problem.
Well, it is a problem because we don't have enough, but we have hundreds and millions of doses. And again, if the plan works correctly, we should be able to greatly diminish the threat. Now, let's take the worst case scenario. The virus mutates away from H5n1. It's something completely different. Then the cycle of production is anywhere from 3 to 6 months. And it would require to have all the vaccine manufacturers work together on this one. Because right now, we are the only company that has demonstrated the efficacy of this methodology we use to make this particular vaccine. But many other companies could make the same vaccine if we had, in advance, planned for it and, in effect, expanded the supply chain for the pandemic vaccine. So this is very important. Well, we went to the governments because we have antitrust legislation which are in the way and other factors. I have met with presidents of major countries several times, and it's taking forever for the bureaucracies to give us the, the permissions, the authorizations, so that we can set it up ahead of time.
So what you're telling me, JP, is that the companies, the big bad companies, have actually agreed with one another. We'll forget about competition in this area. We will. Yeah. Yeah. Is that true?
Yes, we'll forget about competitions and money and profits. This is much bigger than us. We have a chance to help create some kind of a safety net.
But you're stuck in the bureaucracies of the different governments who are saying, well, maybe you can or maybe you can't do that?
Absolutely, and
including our own?
Including our own, I'm afraid to say, but don't spread it around, Ted. I don't want to get it. I want an easy weekend, please. But if you look at other countries, and I'll tell you why, exactly for the point you were making earlier on. If you're a country and you're lucky enough to have one of those manufacturing facilities, because they're not available in every single country, those are typically, by the way, the manufacturing facilities that make the flu vaccine. So there are a few here and there. Well, if you're Germany and you have one straight in the middle of your country, maybe you don't necessarily want, to lose that. You don't want to globalize the supply chain because, in a way, you have a supplier in your backyard. So there are all kinds of complexities. In the US, it's mostly the bureaucracy, I have to say. They have agreed. The president has agreed personally. I've talked to pretty much everybody in the US administration. They're all in favor of it. But I'm still waiting for the letter from the FTC saying you can talk to your competitors on this subject. We'll have lawyers in the room and all the rest of it. Just to be on the safe side, don't want to be tempted. But
Lucy? Yeah.
I think that the problem goes a little further than that. So we've just been talking about the availability of our stockpiled vaccines or stockpiled antibiotics. But in fact, what we don't have in this country is surge capacity. So that we need a lot more than just vaccines and antibiotics stockpiled. We need enough ventilators to go around. We need ordinary things like face masks to protect our population. We need enough supplies of food and general medicines. We need hospital beds. And the way in which our economy runs, which is very sensible, is that you keep inventories down. And this is absolutely orthogonal to what you need to respond to a looming pandemic, a bioterrorist attack, or anything else of that kind.
So when we're talking preemptive action, this is an area where preemptive action is absolutely essential.
Yes, and this kind of surge capacity, which I think is absolutely essential to the future that we're facing now, can be put into effect and would be effective against not only Asian flu and not only a possible bioterrorist attack, but against bacterial infections. And an issue that we have not even touched on just now is increasing resistance to all of our antibiotics. And this is something that most people know about in great depth. But in fact, there isn't a single case where a single antibiotic will get everything. And the resistance to our antibiotics is growing. When we used Cipro against the anthrax scare, we raised the resistance to Cipro by 20%. It was huge. And this is going on constantly. So that there has to be a constant communication at all levels of preparedness, not only from the healthcare workers and our police and our state and local authorities and our federal authorities, but from people understanding how to protect themselves and change the way in which the healthcare system works.
May I? Jerry, this sounds like a job for Yahoo.
Well,
let me explain what I mean, and then I really would like to have you elaborate on it. I think you'll agree, Dr. Shapiro, that in the event of almost any one of these disasters that we're talking about, the most sensible thing that the average citizen can do, just like that, is stay home. Don't go to work.
But you have to have enough food at home to eat.
Precisely. But if you've got enough food at home, if you've got the necessary medicine at home, then we can, to a certain degree, continue working, continue communicating, continue doing all kinds of things that we normally had to travel to do by virtue of Yahoo.
Right. Well, I think Dr. Shapiro's point about the surge capacity applies to our communication infrastructure as well, and I think the Hurricane Katrina incident really highlighted that, in that the internet became almost the first medium after the cell phone capacity went down and fixed line, and the kinds of things that we saw human beings try to do in Louisiana and New Orleans through the computing and the IT infrastructure was truly incredible, in the sense that people rallied around and set up completely sort of bottoms-up ways of finding each other and locating resources and creating a bottoms-up way of exchanging resources, when obviously at the highest level of our government there was some delay in getting those help there. So I think there is a lesson to be learned there from this surge capacity, where and this is an industry issue, not just Yahoo, our colleagues around the country and around the world. I think this is a subject where the bottoms-up, decentralized nature of our internet community can be something where it could conceivably be responsive to a crisis in a way that that has some potential issues with false information. But I think if we are able to have points of control and command, yet letting this infrastructure proliferate, I do think in the surge situation we can do a lot to help. I think once it gets over that steady state, once people are quarantined, or once people are confined, or campuses are dissipated, or our corporate campuses are dissipated because you don't want people next to each other, then I do think that the steady state, where whether it's for communication reasons, which is I think really more of the issue is how do you stay in touch while you're separated, much more than productivity or anything else at that stage, but just staying in touch with important information, families, and people you care about. That I do think the internet can create a role that I think is important to have the infrastructure stay up. And we have discussion of what happens to the data centers that powers the internet today, which doesn't have a lot of capacity. I mean, everybody's trying to build them like there's no tomorrow. And in a time or a place where everybody needs that resource, today there's not enough to go around. So I think that's an issue where we also have to keep looking at it and say, okay, how do we complement, from an information technology standpoint, global issues like this? Because everybody plans to a level of normalcy that won't be nearly as close to what will really happen if something like this happens.
Mr. Secretary.
I think we also need to work much harder than we do on our capacity to exchange on a global basis. If we didn't have a United Nations, we'd be trying to invent one. Our problem is to make it work better. There are a myriad of organizations that pull people together to talk to each other in all parts of the world, and I think we should be nourishing these things. The Group of 8 now meetings, that's a good meeting place for main countries. There's an Asia-Pacific group. That's a good meeting place, and these things ought to be supported. And people go there and they talk together, and they can become vehicles for deciding things like the question you were posing to Justice Kennedy, where we can come to a conclusion that yes, it is important to nip this in the bud, and let's agree on that and actually do it. So I think there's a lot that can be done to build the capacity for international interchange at governmental levels. I've been impressed. Let me just give one example in a totally different area. After 9/11, there was obviously, among other things, a concern that there might be a big economic fallout from it. One of the reasons that didn't happen was that monetary authorities around the world meet periodically, all the time, and they develop confidence and trust in each other. So the man who was the deputy in the Bank of England told me that on the basis of a telephone call to his counterpart at the Federal Reserve, he arranged a $15 billion swap line over the phone in 2 minutes. That undoubtedly helped a lot. Now, that's because people met, knew each other, understood the problem. And I think much more of that is important to do.
The Secretary mentioned the tremendous capacity of NGOs. They actually sometimes almost duplicate each other's efforts, but there are many, many success stories. We've been talking about immunizations. What about water? There's 6 billion people on the face of the globe. Over 2 billion have unsafe drinking water. The greatest single cause of infant disease is diarrhea, and there are other waterborne diseases from toxins, hepatitis. I was at a lecture on water supply, and the lecturer said, now, how many human hours a year are spent in Africa in getting clean water? And he said, the answer is 8 billion. And I said, he must have said 8 million, and I said, must have 80 million. 8 billion hours are spent, it's woman's work, sometimes 6 and 8 hours a day getting clean water. And this is just a success story. Over another 30 billion hours are wasted. This is not rocket science. This can be fixed. But the world's attention is just not focused on these very simple, basic human health needs. And Dr. Shapiro and I were talking earlier about generally women's health issues, which are ignored in so many parts of the world. There's starvation among women and pregnant women and young girls because men eat first. So you have cultural resistance to these things. You have corrupt governments. But surely you find different points on which the international community can agree, and one is something simple like clean water.
I remember just a few years ago, Dr. Perry, the CIA put out an unclassified report on sort of the state of the world. And the point that Justice Kennedy is making was reflected in that report in the sense that water and the struggle for potable water was perceived to be by the agency's analysts the likeliest cause of war over the course of the next century. I don't detect that we're doing a lot about that. Are we? Your former charges over there at the Pentagon have coined a new phrase to describe the condition of enmity that we are in right now with so many different parts of the world as the long war. The implication being that we are currently in a state of war that is going to continue not for another year or two, but for another generation or two, and maybe beyond that. It would seem to me that the most sensible thing we could be doing, as I think Justice Kennedy is suggesting, is to try to take some of the causes of hostility and, insofar as we can, remove them. And that's what we're supposed to be able to do, isn't it?
Let me ask Bill whether it's water or it's oil that will be the real battleground first.
Interestingly enough, water was perceived as a far more likely cause of war than oil. But please.
I would start off by saying that I think it's misnamed a long war. What we're talking about is a long struggle. And the struggle can have, dealing with the struggle can have positive as well as negative aspects. A long war suggests that we're going out and shooting at people. A long struggle means that we put a major part of our effort to helping people, to reduce the causes which are leading to the struggle.
You, I'm sure, know more about this than I do, but indeed, the Marine Corps in particular, you'll be happy to know, Secretary Shultz, is taking that notion of yours to heart. And in fact, the military always has these great acronyms. You know what HOA is?
I do know what HOA is.
Good.
Yes.
Anybody else here know what HOA is? Horn of Africa. And in the Horn of Africa, the Marine Corps is hard at work, in fact, with what in the old days used to be called civic action programs. Digging wells, building schoolhouses, all the kinds of things, precisely what you're saying. Working in what really could more accurately be described as the long struggle rather than the long war.
But I don't want to have you leave that oil question sitting there on the table. And I want to say, looking at all the different things that go wrong because of oil, how many times do we have to be hit on the head with a 2x4 before we make a determined effort to use less oil?
Absolutely. But it is, I think it's about natural resources and how we're going to deliver the natural resources to a growing population around the world, whether that resource is water and sustaining fresh water, it's energy. Remember 30 years ago, 40 years ago, everybody thought the crisis would be food, that we would not be able to grow enough food for the world population. Well, we figured out how to grow enough food. Technology was created, new ways of farming that were more efficient. We have to do the same thing with water. We have to think about water, how we develop water policies, how we use the incredible ability of the earth to filter out materials from water and make safe drinking water and preserve those. We've got to think about alternative forms of energy. We've got to get beyond oil. We should have started a decade or two ago to put a major investment into sustainable energy technologies. We're now 2 decades behind.
John, let me support that, but make one slight correction. We did start 3 decades ago. We started in 1980.
In the 70s.
And in 1980, in the last oil scare, there was a major move to develop renewable energy.
Right.
It lasted for about 1 year.
Right.
And it stopped, not simply because of a change of administration, but more importantly, because oil went down to $15 a barrel again, from $40 to $15. And the belief that was always going to be at $15 a barrel. It was just exceedingly short-sighted. Now that it's at $80 a barrel, we're stuck with the fact that we did not have the last 25 years of developing those programs. This is a problem that is technically solvable.
Agreed.
But it has a lead time to it.
Agreed.
We have to get at it.
And let me point out, the world currently produces roughly 85 million barrels of oil a day. The world currently consumes roughly 85 million barrels of oil a day. If somebody squeezes the balloon in Venezuela or in Canada or in Nigeria or in Iran or in Kuwait, it has an impact on the entire global oil supply. But again, as you know better than I, you've spent a lot of time battling in Washington. We're talking about a political issue here. If someone were to say, let's raise taxes on oil, on gasoline, and use whatever that tax is to develop those alternate energy supplies. What do you think, how long do you think it would be before that person was ridden out of town on a rail?
I had a different proposal. In order to sort of camouflage the notion of a tax. I don't want to put a tax.
I thought you were Reagan appointing.
I thought you were a Reagan appointee.
You introduced the idea of a wedge, and you put a wedge between whatever the market price of oil turns out to be and some price, like $60 or some number like that. And that wedge generates money. And you accumulate into a fund, like they do in Norway or Alaska. And when the fund reaches some number, like $10 billion, you distribute it to all the citizens of the United States. So it's not a tax in the sense that money flows into the government and gets spent. It is a way of saying, we're going to maintain this motivating level of price, but we're going to do it in such a way that we just circulate the money and it flows out to, say, all the people who voted in the last election, or some or
George,
maybe all the
give
people
me
in
10%.
California, or
give me 10%
like that.
to work on research on alternative energy technologies, so we can.
But the point is that we do have to have some way to keep our attention span, as Bill.
Absolutely.
I don't want, and we're well into our second hour already, and so I know, President Hennessy, that there are areas you want to get into, and right after this next riff, I'll let you set the agenda, and we'll go wherever you want to go. But I don't want this distinguished gathering to break up without having discussed at some point, and I should say Justice Kennedy and I had an ex parte conversation a couple of days ago, the essence of which was, my saying to him, I'm sure there are things you can't talk about because they'll come before the court, and he said, you just ask whatever you want and I'll say whatever I want, and that sounds like a fair deal. So here we go. I want to talk about this struggle that is currently underway in the United States between our desire and our perceived need for security on the one hand, and how that is having an impact. Note, I use the word as a noun, which is what it is, not a verb. It doesn't impact on anything. And the impact that it is having on our privacy, constitutional rights. I'm worried as hell about that. It seems to me that we are entering a phase in our national life in which at some point it will be sufficient to charge one of our fellow citizens with having a sympathy for terrorism or a sympathy for a particular group, and all those constitutional guarantees that we love so dearly and take so much for granted will be set aside. Want to take a crack at it?
Well, this is a duality of tension that's not new. In the 1890s, we were gripped with fear by anarchists. They shot 3 presidents, killed 2. Then came the communist threat. In retrospect, we may have overreacted. Now,
may have.
I mean in the domestic sense. This was a serious threat because it was a foreign military power. So one temptation is to say, oh, don't worry, things will work out. Well, suppose we read in the newspaper a week from now that there was a dirty bomb set off in New York. Then what would this answer sound?
Exactly.
The threat is very real. It's very real. Look, democracy fights with one arm tied behind its back. That's the way it's always been, and that's the way it ought to be. Read Pericles' funeral oration. He said, we are besieged on enemies by all sides, but we are courageous people because we are happy, contented, we know what our values are. That is the ultimate security for the United States, is a commitment to the values of the Constitution. The implementation of it, difficult. The more technologically sophisticated we become, the more vulnerable we become. Societies have faced this before. In Victorian England, you could buy a seat in the concert hall, Victoria and Albert Hall, for 900 years. Now, this was a confident society. And And then they had the Flying Scotsman, the railroad train, and they thought the railroad would solve alcoholism and disease. Humankind had been walking at 4 miles an hour for centuries. Now it could go 80 miles an hour. And then criminals got a hold of the gold shipment, and people were paralyzed with fear. There will always be evil people who try to stay one step ahead of the law. And this is a constant threat. It's a real threat. I'm not particularly sure I like the idea of war on terror, because it's going to be going on so long. On the other hand, it's a very real and serious threat, and we have to give careful attention to what our values are and to preserving them. I am confident we can do that, but it involves a commitment on the part of all three branches of the government, and the Congress and the President must recognize that they too have the obligation to think about the Constitution and what it means.
As you were speaking about there will always be bad people wanting to do something evil that we have to defend ourselves against. What if we're not talking about bad people, but about nature? And this is what we're faced with all the time. Let's say that Asian flu mutated, it was out, and we got the word that here in Palo Alto, we had to enact quarantine. How many people in this audience know what that means? How many people know what they would have to do, where they would get medical attention, where their food would come from, how long this goes on, and the laws that govern that, not only in Palo Alto, but in California or the United States, are they clear? Do we know about that? Will some of us say, well, you're impinging on our rights as free citizens to do what we want to do? And we say, not now. You got to stay right where you are. You're not allowed out of here. What do we do?
And Lucy, for a period that could be as long as 3 to 6 months.
That's right. That's correct.
That's the period of time we're talking about. So it would change our society dramatically. Shut the university down. We would probably send home undergraduates. The polite name for this, by the way, is social distancing. But it is quarantine. It is effectively quarantine.
When you say you would send home the students, I hope you would draw a distinction between certain diseases, some of which are communicable and some of which are not.
Of course.
Of course.
Because in the event of a communicable disease, I mean, one of the things that happened, of course, during the 1918 flu pandemic was precisely that people were being shipped all over the country. Most of them were troops coming back from Europe, where they probably caught the disease, and they were being shipped to army camps, and then, you know, moving on trains around the country, and that's how it spread. Yeah. When you raise that rhetorical question, Dr. Shapiro, how many of us here know, or how many of us in the audience, do you raise that because you are confident that you do know, or are you raising it?
No, I'm raising that because I'm confident that we do not know.
None of us know.
None of us.
Right.
Know. Well, except perhaps for President Kennedy.
Well, I know because we have a plan at the university.
But
But
you're not sharing.
Yeah, I'm a professor.
Well, all
here.
your
I don't know
local
about
governments are supposed to have plans and supposed to have clear cut. But I think it is. This would be probably our greatest impact on civil liberties that Americans have ever experienced if we had a pandemic outbreak here. What we'd be telling people, travel. States would shut down their borders very quickly.
Shut down the airlines.
Shut down the airlines.
Yep.
Well, isn't that something we ought to be chatting about?
Yeah.
Ted, on Justice Kennedy's point that the struggle against terrorism is real and serious, which I wholly concur with. I would make the point, though, that in this long struggle, or long war against terrorism, whatever you want to call it, we don't want to win that war by becoming like the terrorists.
Bravo.
And indeed, I think one of the greatest weapons we have in this war is the democratic ideals and the civil liberties which we preserve in this country. And we have to fight this war by continuing to preserve those civil liberties, I believe.
You're clearly preaching to the choir here. But the question I have to raise is, why is there such an absence of heroism in this country when it seems to me we are now going through our second major election campaign in which anyone who dares to suggest what you have just suggested is depicted as being soft on terrorism, just as a few years ago people were being depicted as being soft on communism with the same kind of impact. Lord, we are supposed to be a courageous people who will get up and speak our minds about things like this. Let's talk about that for a moment. Where's the courage gone? It's so damn easy just to tar someone with being soft on terrorism, and that's kind of the end of it.
People were being accused of being soft on communism. Some of them stood up to that. I refer to Edward R. Murrow, for example. So you can stand up to it. It's dangerous, but takes courage, but it can be successful.
All right, Professor Hennessy, it's time for you to take the podium here and tell us what we haven't talked about. I think we've probably got about another half hour, a little bit more. What else should we talk about?
Well, I think, Ted, if there's a thread I could stitch through the conversations here, it really is one that talks about the world as a village now rather than as a set of countries. When we look at all these problems, whether the problem is a threat of a pandemic, issues of natural resources, whether they be oil or water around the world, clearly global warming. California's just passed a law which will reduce California's carbon loading, but that's not going to solve the problem, because if the world warms up, we're going to warm up right along with it. You don't build a boundary around California and keep it a few degrees cooler than the rest of the United States.
But you can try to set an example.
We can, and that's what we're trying to do, George. I agree with that. We're trying to set an example. I think the other characteristic of all these problems, which makes them particularly difficult, is there are pieces of the solution which can be new science and new technology, inventing a new vaccine or a new antibiotic, coming up with alternative forms of energy. But there are also policy pieces. Clearly, part of our problem with nuclear weapons is that technology has escaped. It's gotten out there, people are learning how to do refinement, and that has created a new kind of threat. So we need to think in a different way about policy as well as about the role of technology, and ask how we could bring those two together. And it comes at a particularly challenging time for the country. I think a time when it's hard to get a national consensus on any of these problems. And I'm worried that as the price of oil drops, we'll once again forget about the problem, and 20 years from now, we'll have a much worse crisis than we have today. And I'd like to hear some of my panelists ask about how do we establish more global, talk about how we establish more global leadership on these issues so that we can work in a way across countries, not only in the scientific community, which I think we're fairly good at, but in the policy side as well. And that seems to be quite critical to me.
All right, let me suggest a subject area which I think jumps off that point, and that is media. Because it seems to me that even as we are going from one brilliant technological breakthrough to the next, that substantively we are in a downward spiral. I met with a bunch of your students yesterday afternoon, and I raised the question, how many of you guys here still read newspapers every morning? And about 25% of the hands went up. Then I said, how many of you here use the internet every day. And I'd say about 85% of the hands went up. And then I said, how many of you get your news from television every day?
You should ask how many watch Jon Stewart. That's what you need to ask.
Well, we actually got into that. We got into the issue of Jon Stewart. One hand went up. And I'm ashamed to admit that you know, that's probably our problem, not their problem. That the news on television has deteriorated to such a degree that smart young people simply don't want to spend the time doing it. But the Jon Stewart issue, I'll come to you in just one second, Mr. Secretary. The Jon Stewart issue I find fascinating. I love John. John is an old friend of mine, and I think he does a hell of a funny program. But I often make the point that people who watch Jon Stewart thinking that they're getting the news would probably be very happy if the front page of the New York Times had 7 editorial cartoons on it.
It is, after all, on the Comedy Channel.
It's satire, folks. You need to understand what the story is about before the satire makes a hell of a lot of sense to you.
What you guys are finding yourself in is a competitive world.
Yes.
And for a long time, there were the 3 networks. It was a monopoly.
Exactly.
And now there's competition there. You can get things from all sorts of places. And people are picking and choosing. They're voting, in a sense, with where they turn their dials.
But part of the
problem... And they have an opportunity to do it. They didn't have that before.
Part of the problem, Mr. Secretary, is that 30 years ago, there was a communal quality to the evening news. Somehow the national community gathered to watch Huntley Brinkley and Walter Cronkite and the others, and for at least 25 minutes a day, someone set something of an agenda. This is important, that's important, you ought to know about this, you ought to know about that. In the world of the internet, what scares me a little, Jerry, and maybe you would care to address the subject, is people go only to those areas that they are predisposed to be interested in the first place.
Right. Well, I think that's both the power and the challenge of the medium. And you know, we obviously spend a lot of time talking about this, Ted. Your knowledge of the media probably is way more than mine. But I also feel that we're in a day and age where there is a splintering of attention span and obviously the way messages are delivered, and that attention span is what everybody's competing for. It's competition for attention, not competition for anything else. And I read a study or talked to somebody who told me that, you know, it takes 30 minutes for a serious dialogue for 2 people or somebody to really understand, say, a political issue or one of these propositions that are coming up, or a positioning by a candidate in a legislature race. It takes 30 seconds to completely tarnish and ruin them. And so we live in a world where 30-second commercials are ideal for ruining people's reputations, but are terrible at having a real dialogue about the issue. And so, so I think those of us who are on the side of saying personalized news or predisposed way of understanding things, if that is really where the market is going, let's assume for a second that, you know, it's about my media, not, you know, the way that ABC News or CNN wants to tell me. And that is indeed a generation. I mean, I'm already beyond that generation. I think the graduates of Stanford in 2006 and 2007 will have gone through a world where they did not know the internet didn't exist. Right. You know, as early as they've learned, they understood with the internet. I know one of our panelists earlier was talking about somebody as young as 3 or 4 being able to use the internet to buy something with their father's credit card. And you know, we all laugh at that, but I think the acceleration of our youth using this medium in a way that I can't imagine, and people 10 years younger than me can't imagine, that is only going to continue to accelerate. So I don't know if you can say, well, let's stop that in a way that tries to, again, I don't think you can stop it. So the question really is, how can you take this predisposition around wanting the information I wanted, it's about me, but also start to have a dialogue that is cultured, a lot like this panel is, or sophisticated or intelligent. That is the art of what we have to do in defining the media for the next generation. I do think if you look at the internet, or if you look at efforts like Current TV, where the program editorial is, in the television sense, it was 2/3 produced, 1/3 user generated. That starts to, on the internet it may be 1/3 produced and 2/3 user generated. You can still express a point of view, you can still create a dialogue, but you have to feed into the fact that people want to choose the way they want to engage. And I don't think you can completely tell people what you want to do, because they'll just go off and do something else. At the same time, I do think you can capture the short attention span by engaging in a longer dialogue. You can capture, peaks of interest. You can have that dialogue over a period of time. We see more and more people, whether they're shopping for something, whether they're looking at an issue, whether they're researching something, health, or trying to understand what's a disease. People don't do it in one setting and get it done. They do it in 5-minute chunks. They do it over time, and they do it when they have time. And I think that is a different way of leveraging the media and the tools that we have. Ultimately, I think we have to feed into that behavior, because otherwise you do devolve into the sort of the Jon Stewart is news generation, where, because they don't have any other way to get that. And I do think one thing we want to tie it back to is the role of university in this setting. But I think the media is going to be more fragmented rather than less, is going to be, to the point of bad people, they see this as a way to propagate their idealism, and if the collective whole doesn't treat this as a way of delivering the positive debates and positive message and the value system we care about in terms of civil liberties and the Constitution, I think we do run into danger in our own country having more divisiveness than collectiveness.
Just a couple.
Information is becoming horizontal rather than vertical, maybe.
Yeah.
Part of the problem is the business model that has grown up over the last 20 years or so. I don't know how many of you are aware of the fact that if a sponsor buys a commercial on a program that appeals to the 18 to 30-year-old demographic, that sponsor is paying roughly 5 times as much as if he buys on a program that appeals to a 50 and older demographic. In other words, nobody cares in television.
We're in trouble, guys. Not you, Jerry,
no,
just
Jerry,
the rest of us.
Ted, let me give you somewhat another side of this issue. I have, in my class in national security at Stanford, more than 200 students. They're bright, they're curious, and they're exceptionally well informed on current events. Most of this information comes, by the way, from the internet, not from the TV and not from the print media, but they are very well informed. Now, to be sure, this is not a cross-section of the population, but these are the young people who are going to be our leaders in the future. And I have a very good feeling about them, actually.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific point, but you have made it both elegantly and accurately. I think the great promise of television was that it reached everyone. Yeah. The great promise of free television, over-the-air television, as distinguished from cable or satellite television, where people still have to pay a certain amount of money every month to get it, is that it's available to everyone, and that precious commodity is being squandered. So that, yes, you'll still have a brilliant elite in this country, well-informed, broadly informed, but what about the folks who go to vote?
First of all, this elite comes from the whole great mass of people. They don't come from elites, they come from everywhere. And secondly, the possible substitute for the communal role that television played in our generation is the internet. It hasn't quite evolved that way yet, but I think it has the best potential. of being that communal source of information.
Okay. We're down to about our last 20 minutes or so. So if I may say to you, JP, please, any subject you want to lead us into.
Just a point on, the last 15 minutes you've been discussing the medium. And I don't have any doubts that the younger generation is smarter, if anything, about information. They're very savvy, using multiple sources and making up their minds on issues. But that's sort of the medium is not what, to me, is the most important in terms of what's lacking. It's the content. The content is really, it is. You look at, for instance, at Washington or any other government for that, and it is the MTV generation there. 2 minutes on this, 2 minutes on that, and there's no continuity. Our politicians are not giving a great example here. There is no oomph in their message. There is no vision. There is no mission. There is no, Kennedy saying we're gonna, conquer space. That was an exciting statement for the younger people. There was something to shoot for. It doesn't really matter at the end what happens, this month and next month, but there's a lack of taking the initiative and providing content, real meaningful content, having bold goals for the world or for your nation. And that is clearly missing. We don't have statement the way we used to. That, I think, is for whatever reason, is right now we are in a vacuum, and this is a dangerous vacuum. And the nations on the earth, when you travel throughout the world, you sense it, that, like it or not, the Muslim world has found some kind of an upper goal to reach for, and they're prepared to do that, and they are giving content and meaning to the life of 1 billion people who are not that pleased about the status of affairs. We need to reconquer this space and give content to the younger generation.
As I mentioned earlier, I was in Iran about 10 days ago and had lunch with an Iranian doctor who said, Ted, in the old days, we used to pray at home and go out to drink. Now, he said, we drink at home and we go out to pray. So, part of the problem, and it extends beyond media, it extends to government. The networks, the newspapers, the CIA, they're all diminishing their overseas staff for reasons of economic pressure. What happens at the network is you're sitting there with a bunch of bean counters, and they come back and say, well, the Moscow Bureau. Moscow Bureau is costing $3.5 million a year. We see that it only had 50 reports from Moscow on your various programs throughout the year. That works out to $70,000 a shot. That's too expensive. Close it down. And that's what's happening. When I was a young foreign correspondent, ABC had about 25 or 30 foreign correspondents. Now it has 5. The same thing is happening in government with the CIA. It's closing down a lot of it, not closing down, but diminishing human intelligence, which is, in the final analysis, for all that we can do from satellites and by overhearing conversations, human intelligence is still the most useful. So, the point you make is exactly right. Lucy, what have we left unsaid in our almost 2 hours here?
I think one of the things, since we're in a university and talking about what happens in a university, is the kind of education that we give to our students. And we live in an increasingly technological society. We hopefully give a broad liberal education to our students in many quarters. But unless every student understands critical issues at a scientific and technological level, because that's how our globe is running, they're not going to be able to make critical decisions when the time comes about weapons, about diseases, about how to pass laws and deal with what's right and wrong, picking up what Justice Kennedy said, you have to understand something before you can take a stand. And we recently had a symposium in the Beckman Center this week on evolution. And we did that not to raise the issue of religion versus science, not to deal with creationism versus intelligent design, but rather to teach. What do we know? How are we approaching things? And I was actually quite pleased to see that we had a very broad representation of the student body coming to this thing. But somehow we have to instill in our universities this grounding in understanding the basic things that are changing our globe and are going to change our life and the lives of our children. And so I think that this is something that President Hennessy can continue with, but this is something that we're trying very hard to do here at Stanford.
I agree with that, Lucy. I think we have failed as a country to teach our young people scientific literacy. I think we're increasingly, as Justice Kennedy alluded to, failing to teach them about the core principles that have made this country great. Go one step further. Ask people what rights are guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. I think you'll find a very small number of Americans who can tell you what those rights are. We need to do a better job there. It is an incredible situation when a large fraction of Americans don't believe in evolution. And it is evolution that's the long-term threat with new infectious diseases. It's evolution that's going to create the next pandemic. We need to have a better understanding of that. We need to understand that a terrorist only needs a suitcase full of plutonium to create a strategic disaster for all of us. And I think the way in which technology and science have shaped our world in the last 50 years has simply been stunning. We need to make sure that all our students understand that at the same time as they understand the core principles on which this country is founded. And that's a critical challenge for all of us in universities, not just at Stanford. It's a critical challenge in our K-12 system. One of the fascinating things is I spent the last year traveling around meeting with alumni talking about issues like environment, medical research, and how we were going to combat those issues, issues of peace and terrorism. And the challenge I heard raised by many of our alumni was, what about K-12 education, which is seriously broken in this country?
Both of you have just sort of brushed against a subject that perhaps we can just spend a couple of minutes talking about, because it may be the most influential subject in the world right now in terms of where we're going, and that is religious fundamentalism. Whether that be the Christian evangelical movement, or whether that be Orthodox Judaism, or whether that be Islamic fundamentalism, it is having an enormous impact on where countries are going and what countries are doing, and indeed on this on this international crisis that is building with each passing day. I was telling Lucy and some of the other guests at the table last night, I had been unaware until I went to Iran of the story of the hidden imam, the 12th imam. It turns out that certainly Shiite Muslims believe that the 12th imam, who was a direct descendant of Muhammad, went into hiding as a young boy, and the story that surrounds him and his eventual reappearance on earth is strikingly similar to the story around the second coming of Christ, or the coming of the Jewish Messiah, in that his reappearance will, in the minds of some people, not all Shia, but in the minds of some Shiite Muslims, have to be preceded by an apocalyptic event. Iranian President Ahmadinejad is said to believe that. Whether that is so, I don't know. but look at the coincidence that finds Iran at the moment and the United States at the moment, where in both countries there are influential segments of society believing that the coming of the Savior needs to be preceded by Armageddon. Wow. So, anybody want to talk about religion? Or,
Well,
I thought we had passed through the time of the Enlightenment and come to the other side where rational thought would...
Actually, what this demonstrates, if nothing else, is that you don't raise any dummies here at Stanford, do you?
Right, exactly. And certainly, I think we face a challenge. We face a challenge of trying to do a better job on education. We face the challenge of having schools which put religious education not in parallel to the rest of the educational tradition, but somehow place it over it. And I think that's where we find ourselves in a difficult situation. But we, as Americans, also need to do a better job of learning more about the rest of the world. Look at Islam. We don't know enough about Islamic tradition, Islamic culture, and beliefs in this country. And I think given it is the second largest religion in the world and the fastest growing, we need to do a better job of educating ourselves and our students.
In this discussion, we have focused almost entirely on problems. And
yeah, I think the name of the subject was Anxious Times.
Right.
Here.
There's a subtitle, though.
And
I didn't see that part. Yeah.
I think it's appropriate, and let me tell you why it's so important to examine problems and figure out how to deal with them effectively. The reason is, or one of the big reasons is, that the world has never been in a more encouraging state. There is, the International Monetary Fund publishes each year a global economic thing. And there's a table in this booklet that has countries, sections of the world, last year, this year, next year, their projections on the economic terms. And the stunning thing about that table is there's not a minus sign on it. I don't mean that there aren't negatives in some countries, but the prospects for economic growth and more openness around the world are absolutely stunning. And if you talk about anti-poverty, look at what's happening in China and India just to begin with. Huge eradication of poverty in those countries. So on the economic side, it's mostly good news. Then we're living longer. We're healthier longer. Big time. And that is in considerable part due to what Lucy and JP do and others. So we're understanding the human body and how it works better. And we have invented machines like the MRI and so forth that allow diagnostics without intrusive surgery. And it's just everywhere you look, there are also good things, not just problems. And it's because there is so much promise that I think it's particularly urgent to grapple with these problems that we've been talking about and do so successfully.
Thank you. That was an important note of optimism to have injected into the conversation.
No,
I mean it very sincerely. Thank you.
It was just an observation of what's going on.
Yeah. You know, you're absolutely right, and not to take a thing away from what you've said, but for every India, there is also a Republic of the Congo, where over the past 5 years, 4.5 million people have died as direct and indirect consequences of a war that the world is paying no attention to whatsoever. You're a doer, I'm an observer, and I thank God for the doers, because observers don't get anything done. I mean, that's You're absolutely right. Justice Kennedy.
On some of the bad news side, and then there's also very good news. In Dubai, they've just abolished camel racing. This is very important. 1,000 young infants a year, 4 to 5, were used to whip the camels in the camel races. They were starved in order to keep them at a low weight. And they finally just abolished camel racing. Never made the news. Tens of thousands of children are trafficked. In some areas of Africa and Bangladesh, you see blind children because their parents have sold their corneas. This is the kind of evil that exists in the world that the press ought to talk about. Is there a good side? Of course. I've had the privilege of teaching for over 40 years now. I see in this generation of students, Mr. President, an altruism, a moderation, a civic commitment, a decency, a balance, a rationality that I haven't seen in 40 years of teaching. The challenges are huge. China is 1.3 billion. If you forget the billion, the 3 makes them the second biggest country in the world. They're the second biggest country in the world without the billion. We must learn to engage with the Chinese on a rational basis. You're talking about religion and rationality. You know who the most famous man in the world was before Washington? And it was Newton. Mm-hmm. He was the poster boy for the Enlightenment that you mentioned. And then Washington succeeded to that because this group, because he was the poster boy for the founders. And these founders thought through the idea of reason and of rationality. If we can find the secrets of the universe, we can find the secrets of the government. And they drew the Constitution, which is the oldest living constitution in the world. But something happened to rationality. And I won't go through it all. There was the German Confederation of 1848, which failed, set us on the course of World War I. In World War I, the supposedly most civilized nations on earth were killing hundreds of thousands of young men in the trenches. There has never been a confidence in rationality since. We're still trying to find a way. In order to have a decent, rational, democratic discourse that's not hostile, fractious, divisive, mundane, trivial. This we must teach to the rest of the world, and make no mistake. The verdict is out. Millions in the rest of the world are suspending judgment on whether democracy works, and we must teach that it does, because that's the core of human freedom, and that's the inspiration in each human's breast that he or she demands control over his or her own destiny.
I must confess, Justice Kennedy, I was a little concerned when I heard that one of the panelists was going to be a sitting member of the Supreme Court, because I didn't think you'd be able to say much. and I can't wait until you retire and can cut loose. We're just about out of time. I never get to do this, so I'm gonna grade the panel. You're A+. It's so extraordinary in this day and age to be able to have a conversation on controversial issues in which the tone remains civil throughout, in which all of the participants give so generously and so smartly of their intelligence. And I want to make one other observation before we call it a day. And that is, it's a nice Saturday morning out there, and look at this. Thousands of people who have gathered us here this morning to listen to a bunch of smart people talk about tough issues. That's an optimistic note too, isn't it? And so thank you to all of you, and thanks to our panelists. We're done. You can sit here if you want to. All right.
Well done.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.